Well, hello, friends. We are live with Dr. Kristin Kobes Du Mez, and we are absolutely thrilled. Thank you so much for joining us for this live conversation. Just a couple housekeeping notes. We are live on YouTube, which means that all of your comments, if you would be so kind as to comment on the internet in the spirit of this particular program and not in any other spirit that might happen to come across on internet. Anyway, you know what I'm talking about. We have about an hour of prepared questions and conversations that we have, but then we're going to be taking questions from Slido. I've put the event number up there for you. We've already had a couple submissions of questions as well, so we're super excited about that. Just go to sli.do and enter in event number 81793, and we would appreciate it if you would submit questions as well as upvote those questions so that you, our amazing captive audience, can participate and contribute to the conversation today. That's it. That's all the housekeeping. We're going to get right into it. Dr. Du Mez, or just for the record for everybody watching, she has given me permission to call her Kristin, especially since we're talking about patriarchy and titles and all that kind of stuff. So I just want to make sure we're on record.
Cool.
We're cool. So Kristin, first of all, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. Thank you for saying yes. And thank you for staying up late all the way out there in Michigan. We so appreciate
thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here with you.
Okay, so you wrote this amazing book, Jesus and John Wayne. It's gotten a lot of, and I'm going to start with a little bit of a bone to pick with you. I'm a little upset actually. So here's where we're going to start. You write that white evangelicalism has such an expansive reach in large part because of the culture it has created. This is on page 7, the culture that it sells. And then you list, they've raised children with the help of James Dobson's Focus on the Family, or grown up watching VeggieTales. They rocked out to Amy Grant, or The Newsboys, or DC Talk. They learned about purity before they learned about sex, and they have a silver ring to prove it. They watched The Passion of the Christ, Soul Surfer, or the latest Kirk Cameron film. With their youth group, they attended Promise Keepers with guys from church and read Wild at Heart in small groups. I want to know, when did you get a hold of my journal, my personal journal? I'm a little ticked off about it actually, because this is about how white evangelicals corrupted a faith and fractured a nation. And I'm like, oh, well, I must be one of those. So I just need to start with that little, just wanted to put you on blast there. Just say thank you.
Yeah. Expansive reach, right? Expansive reach. And you are not alone. I have heard really the most frequent response that I get from readers is some version of, this is the story of my life. And then that usually follows with multiple paragraphs of all of the examples of every point in this book that actually did parallel their own lives. And so, yes, it's a book about popular culture. So I think it speaks to a lot of people where they're at.
Yeah, there was that one moment where you're talking about Promise Keepers, and I'm like, oh my goodness, I was at every single one of those events, and my father took me there. Okay, so anyway, all right, this is not about me, but I just needed to get that off my chest for just the beginning. This is an incredible read and an incredible historical survey that is helping us to understand our political, our social, and our religious context. And so we've got quite a bit of ground to cover here. And I want to start with talking about culture. Actually, let me back up. Why did you write this book? That's the first question I want to ask. And that's a two-pronged question. What got you started in writing the book? But then also, what do you hope will ultimately come about as a result of this book being out in the world?
Yeah, I first came up with the idea that became this book more than 15 years ago. I was a new professor at Calvin University here in Michigan, and I was teaching a U.S. survey course, and I gave a lecture on Teddy Roosevelt. And I wanted to introduce my students to the concept of gender in history, especially masculinity in that case. And I showed how Teddy Roosevelt's masculinity wasn't just this personal thing, but it was connected to broader economic shifts, his very kind of muscular, militaristic sense of manhood. It was linked to American power, to empire, Rough Riders, Spanish-American War. And so I wrapped up that lecture. And afterwards, a couple of guys from the class came up to me and said, Professor Du Mez, there's a book that you have to read. I actually have it here with me. It was John Eldredge's Wild at Heart. So this was back in 2005 or 2006. And I mean, by that time, that book was everywhere. I'd heard of it. I knew that all the guys at Calvin were reading it in dorm groups. My own church was hosting study groups on it. And so I listened to him. I opened it up, and sure enough, a quote from Teddy Roosevelt opens the book. And Eldridge goes on to sketch a very militant, militaristic conception of Christian manhood. So, God is a warrior God, and all men are made in his image. Every man has a battle to fight. So this was back in 2005 or 2006, early years of the Iraq War. And I was reading that book, and I was also seeing all the survey data that was coming my way, that white evangelicals were far and away more likely to support the Iraq War, to support preemptive war in general, to condone the use of torture. And I just started to kind of wonder, what might one have to do with the other? And so I started to dig in for about a year and a half. I did some research into this, and then I set the project aside. For a couple of reasons. One, what I was uncovering was incredibly disturbing, deeply misogynistic, right? This was the height of Mark Driscoll, very, again, militant, militaristic. And so I was troubled. Is what I'm looking at really just a fringe movement, right? Because it certainly felt extreme. And I'm a Christian myself. And I thought, is it responsible for me to be shining the bright light, my historical research on what might be the darkest underbelly of American Christianity? Is that really what I should be doing?
Just a good career
and so
move.
I set it aside. Right. Well, I'm actually looking back somewhat troubled by that impulse. Right. It seemed like a noble thing at the time. I'm actually troubled by it, trying to provide cover, I suppose, not following where my research was taking me. Set it aside. I had other things going on. I had a kid, and then another kid, and then another kid. And so I kept meaning to get back to it. But I didn't stop paying attention. And so I was watching some of these guys, and I watched as one after another in the ensuing decade became implicated in abuse scandals, abuse of power or sexual abuse. And then fast forward to the fall of 2016, we saw white evangelicals starting to support Trump, and we saw the release of the Access Hollywood tape. And all of a sudden, things clicked for me that we had seen these patterns before. We had seen evangelicals support, in some cases, abusive leaders. We had seen these patterns, and I started listening to the language that many evangelicals were using to explain their support for Trump. He was the strong man, the ultimate fighting champion, and things kind of clicked at that point. And so at that point, I dusted off the old research, and I wrote this book. What I hope to accomplish with it, really, I just wanted to tell the story. I think very early on, I thought I could change something here, right? I can expose some of this, and people are going to change their path. And then about a few months into the writing of the book, I was really overwhelmed because I saw just how deeply embedded these ideals are, how far back they stretch. And at that point, I kind of gave up on the change people's hearts part. And I just wanted to tell the story. I just wanted to testify, just tell the truth. And that's really what I tried to do in this book, the unvarnished truth as powerfully as I could.
That's an interesting turn. You say you kind of shifted away from wanting to turn hearts and just to testify. I don't know. I don't know if I have a question there, but I'm really intrigued by that because I feel like I feel like that kind of encapsulates so much of what our cultural moment kind of is embracing and experiencing, where we want to ultimately change hearts, but then at some particular point, you're like, oh, I just need to speak the truth. But in many ways, speaking the truth is the first step towards the changing of hearts, right? So.
It is. So I think, coming full circle, once the book came out, I realized that just telling that truth and telling it as powerfully as I could, without holding back, without trying to soften the sharp edges in any way, that has, in fact, I think, I don't know if it's changed individuals. I think it's changed the conversation some. And I think for some communities, for some folks, it is doing something. And it's really gratifying to see that.
Yeah. So my second half of that question was like, well, what are you hoping is a result? Do you kind of, and coming full circle again, kind of hope people's hearts and minds will change? I mean, I just asked you before we went live
Yeah.
how well the book has been received. You're receiving very positive, overwhelmingly positive reception to the book. So let me just ask the question again within that context. What do you ultimately hope will come about as a result of this book being out in the world?
Yeah, well, the first thing that I think is so it's a history book, right? It's covers a lot of history, and I think there is power in that, in simply describing how things came to be, right? How we got to where we are now, because I think that all of us, but maybe especially evangelicals or Christians, have a tendency to kind of see things in static terms. This is God ordained. This is the way things have always been, throughout all of time. And to take a step back and look at things like, Christian masculinity or femininity or Christian nationalism and these sorts of things, and realize that if you go back in time, things didn't always look the way they look now. And so then you can start to see, well, how did we get to this point? Who made choices? To what ends? What were their motivations? And often we can see it's to enhance their own power. And we can kind of trace this story and then get up to where we are now. And it no longer feels inevitable. It no longer feels like this is the only possible choices that we have. And so I think it frees us up in this moment. If we see how we got to this place, it frees us up to ask the question, is this where we want to be?
Yeah.
And so history can do that in a kind of distancing way that opens up conversations in the present. And I think that is the hope that I have for this book, to just free us up to ask, is this in fact where we want to be? To open the scriptures and then to look around us and decide what we need to set aside and what we need to carry forward.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I love it. Okay, so let's dig in a little bit. I was struck by the cultural aspects, specifically of the wars that you talk about in your book. And, because this is my personal life journal, growing up, I had this sense that there was always this contentious relationship with the culture, and we had to be in the world, not of it. And so we're fighting the culture and we're having to be against it, and all the things that are happening in the culture are somehow an affront to our faith and our Christianity, etc. But I couldn't help but think that these wars that you describe, specifically World War II, Vietnam, and the Gulf War, were actually cultural events that were highly influential into the shaping of this kind of masculine expression of American evangelicalism. So what would you say to that assessment? And can you describe a little bit more the role that perhaps that particular aspect of culture and then others played in the shaping, and on that platform, that culture is actually far more influential in our expression of faith than we admit, I suppose.
Yeah. I think we tend to talk about, this is just Christianity. It's just the gospel, right? And aren't able to see in our own cultural moment just how much our cultural moment shapes our understanding of the gospel. So yes, war is really an important theme throughout this book, wars. So starting in the Second World War, talking about things not always having been the way they are today. It was a good war, but Americans generally and American evangelicals were pretty skittish about the military. A lot of evangelicals didn't want their sons to go and serve because it was a place where morals would be corrupted. And there was very good evidence that was the case. And then we moved to the Cold War era, right, immediately after the Second World War. And then we start to see where this Cold War militarism starts to be widely embraced, but particularly among American Christians and American evangelicals, because communism was anti-God and anti-American and anti-family, and like all the things that conservative evangelicals held dear. And so that was a kind of key period for evangelicals as they kind of hold these values together. But what's important to realize is in the early Cold War era, evangelicals weren't super unusual in holding those values and defending, Christian America. This was consensus era. This was, the baby boom, traditional family values, all of that, at least for white middle-class Americans. And so then we have to get to the 1960s where we start to see that start to break down. And in the 1960s, the Vietnam War, 60s and 70s, really becomes this almost dividing line. You have the civil rights movement, you have feminism, and then you have the Vietnam War. And for many evangelicals who had come to embrace the military and really embrace Christian nationalism, this need to defend America and to do so militarily, the Vietnam War was a huge crisis moment because we could see that the good war didn't necessarily apply in Vietnam. Our boys were not winning this war. What had gone wrong? And then you have the anti-war movement, and you have a broad swath of Americans who are starting to question American greatness and American goodness. They're questioning the war effort. And that's when conservative evangelicals, both in terms of the threats of the feminist movement that they perceived and also the anti-war movement, really double down on these values and understand that they are now kind of an embattled minority, or if not quite a minority, they are the faithful remnant. And it's their job from that point on to really kind of reassert these quote unquote traditional values over against the views of many other Americans. And so Vietnam is this crystallizing moment. And when I started my research and I started to read all of these books on Christian masculinity from the 1990s, the Promise Keepers era, and into the 2000s, I was really struck how many of them open with scenes from Vietnam, how Vietnam continues to be this kind of touchstone for what is proper masculinity, what is proper Christian manhood, what is true American manhood. And it was like they were still wrestling with what had gone wrong in Vietnam and still trying to redeem that moment.
So I'm kind of curious, like there must have been some sort of religious idea or insecurity or fear that kind of made that moment kind of the nexus moment for this patriarchal shift. I don't want to hyper psychologize, I suppose, but is there, to say that, I guess there's a Vietnam War crisis and the anti-war movement, all of that's churning within American culture at that particular time. You just said that even American evangelicals take on either themselves the mantle of the faithful to preserve. Was there something that prompted that? Because, and I guess I'm jumping ahead, later on in the book you talk about the atheological posture that people have. They say that they're actually following the Bible, but in reality they're following cultural ideals, just simply using biblical phrases and verses and terminology, etc. And I'm just kind of curious, can you trace that back to that moment in Vietnam and Cold War era? Like, what was it? There must have been something there that allowed that Vietnam moment to launch that.
Yeah. And it wasn't just the Vietnam moment. It wasn't just what was happening in Vietnam. It was also what was happening right in the United States in response. And when I was reading what evangelicals were really concerned about, what they were writing about in the 1960s and early 70s in particular, this really starts to crystallize. They're deeply concerned about their own children, about how to raise their children in an era that suddenly seemed incredibly destabilized, right? Coming out of the 50s and the early 60s when again, post-war era, a time of affluence, a time of seeming stability, supported by government spending and the GI Bill and so on, and things seemed very stable for a time. And then things start to feel like they're unraveling. And for many parents felt this acutely. And this was when James Dobson, came into prominence, and he was going to provide answers. And he was deeply concerned about the disorder of the anti-war movement, the hippies on the streets, the lack of proper discipline that would create a stable society. And so this was this larger cultural issue or social issue. And but it was also a deeply personal issue that you're raising your kids and you're looking around and you're thinking, what is going to come next for them, and how can I raise my own children? So there's that kind of deep concern. But I would also say, in the book, I really do come back to the question of white patriarchal authority during this time. Because if you look at the factors that are most destabilizing to evangelicals and to conservatives, The civil rights movement is huge. And a lot of American evangelicals are Southerners, are white Southerners. And so white Southerners in particular are feeling the threat of their social order with the civil rights movement. And they end up wanting to reinforce their authority as parents, right, over against desegregated schools, and to kind of claim that power over against feminism, which is disrupting, family ideals, and then again to protect their children. And in all of these settings, the answer is the same. It's reasserting this traditional white patriarchal authority, and that kind of links these things together.
This is one of the most intriguing aspects, I think, of your work. We just had Jamar Tisby just about a month ago talking about how to fight racism and the church's complicity in racism. And what was fascinating to me reading both of these books in conjunction with each other, and then also some personal experiences that I shared with you about trying to get other churches to talk about masculinity and patriarchy. There seems to be a nice cultural moment for talking about racism, and everybody wants to jump on board and talk about how we can fight racism, because that's a clear. But when we're talking about gender and masculinity and femininity, there wasn't as much of a market, shall we say, for this kind of conversation. But what you just said, I think, is so crystallizing in trying to, because it's on your cover, how white evangelicals. So can you explain that just a little bit further? Because you make the argument essentially through the course of the book that this whole expression of masculine Christianity and patriarchy is actually tied to race. And the two, you can't, well, I don't want to overstate.
No, go ahead. You can't really separate it.
You can't really separate. Okay, so explain, help our audience and help me understand why patriarchy and race are intricately tied together and why we need to talk about both and not just one over the other.
Yeah. So when I was starting to look at all these books on Christian masculinity, what I first discovered is they love their heroes. They love this. In fact, the very earliest file that I opened on this research project all those years ago, I just called hero worship. And then I started to pay attention to who were their heroes. Well, William Wallace from the movie Braveheart, huge hero. So Mel Gibson's William Wallace.
Again, you're in my journal. What are you doing? Stop. Where are my royalties?
You are not alone. Not alone. And then like random soldiers and warriors and American soldiers and cowboys. Cowboys are big, and General MacArthur. And, it's this very familiar cast of characters. And then, yes, John Wayne also was a frequent hero icon that writers on evangelical masculinity would turn to. And then I started to pay attention to race. And none of the heroes again, huge cast of characters, they were all white guys. And not just white guys, but in many cases, if you look at John Wayne, for example, Teddy Roosevelt is another favorite. These are white men who are bringing order through violence, often through subduing non-white populations. So think about John Wayne, right? The hero cowboy fighting Indians or Mexicans, and then Sands of Iwo Jima, American fighting Japanese, Green Berets, again, American soldier subduing North Vietnamese. And this is just a common motif. So then I started to pay attention to how race functioned, and that this militant and militaristic ideal of Christian masculinity was a white ideal, that men of color in these conversations in this discourse were often perceived not as the men who were called to this militant, aggressive masculinity. They were the ones that needed to be defended against. So they were dangerous. They were, black men who, that's what law and order politics were for, or, immigrants. They need to be kept out. And so race was not often stated explicitly, but when I started to look carefully, these patterns emerged very clearly. So yes, this was historically, going back to the 1960s, 1970s. This was a white patriarchal authority that they were working to reassert, and then all the way up to the present. And I trace in the book too how every once in a while this does actually become quite visible, where Confederate generals become the heroes that are celebrated, right? And where very explicit racism it seems to be okay in some of these circles. It's smoothed over. It's that's not going to get you defined outside of the fold. But you cross the line on gender or LGBTQ, and then you're excluded from these communities.
Yeah, I just pulled up your quote here. Wayne's masculinity, page 56. Wayne's masculinity was unapologetically imperialist. All of Wayne's greatest hits involved valiant white men battling and usually subduing non-white populations, the Japanese, Native Americans, or Mexicans. And then you have this quote from John Wayne, 1971 interview in Playboy magazine, incredibly. I don't like to read these things out loud, but for the sake of historical record, I believe in white supremacy until all the blacks are educated to a point of responsibility. I don't believe in giving authority and positions of leadership and judgment to irresponsible people. So yeah, that's not terribly subdued, or I mean, this is explicit,
right? It's explicit, and that's why John Wayne is such an interesting character, because he's this persona, right? He's this on-screen hero. He becomes a symbol, again, an icon. But then in real life, he's also reinforcing these politics. He's also, he's supporting Barry Goldwater. He's supporting Phyllis Schlafly. He's supporting Ronald Reagan. And yes, he's explicitly racist. He's pro-law and order. He embodies this, and he symbolizes it, and he expresses it in so many ways.
Yeah. I don't think this section that we just talked about can be overstated. Again, in our cultural moment where we're talking about racism, we have to talk about patriarchy. We have to talk about masculinity, because the two are inextricably tied together. So let's shift a little bit, because I do want to talk a little bit about what masculinity is. I want to talk about fear and power. And actually, let me ask this question, because it feels to me like the development, as I was reading through all this and this assertion of masculine power or authoritarianism or whatever, felt to me, and again, I might be hyper-psychologizing here, felt to me like one big exercise in the fragile male ego. What say you, Dr. Du Mez?
I'm not going to deny that. I'm not a psychologist, so I have no authority to overrule that. So I can go with that.
Yeah.
No, I mean it does. It is linked to fear, right? It is linked to fear of a loss of status, and that certainly seems consistent.
Well, that fear issue is something that I think we've talked extensively. Our church and other people have talked extensively about. I read this quote a while ago. I'm still kind of musing about it, kind of simmering in it, that conservative people are not more fearful. It's fearful people that are more conservative. And that quote kind of helps me frame a little bit of why in your book you talk specifically about conservatives as the general group, the general tribe, political and social tribe that hangs on to this kind of masculine expression. So is that, I don't want to be unfair, but I mean, that seems to be the case. Help me navigate that, because it feels wrong in some ways to say, well, it's conservatism versus liberalism or all those particular categories. But because fear and the grab for power seems to be so prominent in this development, it's hard not to think about those categories.
Mm-hmm. Well, when I first started this project, and I was a ways in, and I was kind of working with the assumption, kind of the standard narrative to explain white evangelical politics in recent years has been, evangelicals are so afraid. They're so afraid, so they're kind of lashing out, or they're desperate, and so they're afraid of demographic change. They're afraid of losing their religious freedom. They're afraid of, all sorts of things, and so they had no option but, to embrace the politics of somebody like Donald Trump, for example, and And then when I look back to history, I realized that the story needed to be changed, that we needed to flip the script in many cases, because I saw time and again where rather than militancy being a response to fear, that fear was actively stoked by militant leaders. So somebody like Jerry Falwell Sr. in Thomas Road Baptist Church, somebody like Mark Driscoll in Mars Hill, was a very clear pattern where they were actively manufacturing fear in the hearts of their followers, persistently doing so in order that their followers would then come to them for protection. So it was a way to enhance their own power and demand loyalty from their followers. And once I saw that pattern, actually the clearest place where that bubbled up for me was in post 9/11, in the case of these fraudulent ex-Muslim terrorists. I have a chapter on them. It's bizarre stories, but they were sponsored by the SBC, by Focus on the Family. Mainstream evangelical powerhouses were hosting these ex-Muslim terrorists who were complete frauds, who were telling the stories of just how scary the Muslims were, and they were coming to attack Americans and American Christians. And what really struck me was not just that evangelicals were parading these guys around, but they were doing so long after they knew that their stories were entirely fraudulent. And that was a moment that clicked for me too. So the fear was being manufactured. The fear was real in the hearts of the followers. It was a very real fear, but I had to understand that it was actively stoked. And so militancy required fear more often than fear prompted militancy. But of course, it's kind of circular.
I'm really stunned right now. That's man, what an insightful observation and analysis. Because I think this was just, I'm stunned because it's helping me shift my thinking. I think I've always thought that fear is primal, right? It's our evolutionary psychology. And so, of course, there's going to be these things that are going to be expressed in our society and in our politics and our religion based upon that fear. But to analyze a religion's manufacturing and utilization of fear and deployment as a tool of power in many ways, I think is just kind of stunning to me. And really, I don't think that can be, once again, overstated, how to understand when that is being deployed. And we've all heard the sermons, right? They're coming for you. And there's a lot of finger pointing and a lot of if you don't, then this is what's going to happen to you and your children and your, right?
Yes.
This whole kind of culture. I guess part of me why I'm so stunned and I'm kind of grappling for words here is you almost can't forgive them in the same way. Like before I kind of gave them a little bit of a pass. Like, well, I understand, evolutionary psychology. Of course we're fearful, but now it's kind of like, wait a second, gosh darn it, you son of a, I want to kind of be a little bit more angry and hold those people accountable for the kind of religion that they are expressing and promulgating and and I love the word manufacturing in the world. Is that fair? Sorry, I needed a moment again.
I as you read the book, you probably sensed that I was angry at times as well. And I think that's a proper response. Yeah. I really toyed with opening the book with a quote from Marilyn Robinson that fear is not a Christian habit of mind. And the reason I didn't actually was because that's actually not true to the history that I tell. And, ideally we would like for that to be the case, but the Christians in this book, fear was very much a habit of mind. But I love that as a kind of inspirational quote, as a grounding quote to remember that, fear not is repeated throughout the scriptures, and that fear absolutely should not be a Christian habit of mind.
Right. Okay. Let's thank you for that. That was I'm going to take that with me for a long time. That's fantastic. I want to ask you about women's complicity in the masculine expression of American evangelicalism, because I think one of the things that's so interesting about this is that you would think that the adherence and affection towards masculinity would fall along gender lines. Like men would be for this and women would be against this. But very much like I've learned through the race conversation that people, your race is almost irrelevant to the ideas that you hold, or it can be. You can still hold to racist ideas. I've used the example for me because I grew up white evangelical, that I had anti-Asian ideas growing up, even though I'm ethnically and racially Asian. You write about Phyllis Schlafly, as we mentioned, Anita Bryant, the resistance against the Equal Rights Amendment, this disdain for the feminist movement. Help us understand women's complicity and championing, in many ways, this kind of religious expression.
Yeah. And this kind of enduring patriarchy would not endure if it weren't for the support of women.
Yeah.
So, it's important to clear that up right away. But if you go back in time, I really tried to understand what were women like Phyllis Schlafly thinking, or Elizabeth Elliot, or Maribel Morgan. I mean, there's some interesting characters. Yeah. That's one of my favorite chapters in the book. And what I came to see is for individual women, it varied, why they would throw their support behind this kind of patriarchal ideology. For many, it's important to realize that feminism was not the be-all, end-all. That feminism, kind of burst on the scene for them in the 60s and 70s in particular, when a lot of women had already kind of cast their lots with, they were housewives, they were moms, they didn't have careers. Many didn't have much of an education. And so to all of a sudden be told, hey, the world is your oyster, come on, go achieve, grab that career. And it wasn't practical in any way. Some women were perfectly happy being a wife and mother and not having a career. And it's important to respect that as well. For some women, that they felt absolutely fulfilled there. For other women, it wasn't a good fit. For many women in the problem that has no name, that when Betty Friedan was able to give expression to this idea that, is this all? That many women were chafing under the constraints, including many evangelical women too. So there's a variety of responses. But many of those women had been taught and were being taught, this is God's will for you. This is how you are a faithful Christian as a woman. Somebody like Elizabeth Elliot really made that case powerfully. And so you'll have some women who are just like, this is the best I can do. Feminism wasn't for them. There were some that would have, preferred a different life, but really felt that they were obeying God. And then there are there's also the fact that if we bring race into the equation, that white women had certain privileges and advantages if they played by the rules, and playing by the rules was really important. So you are the proper wife and mother, and then your husband will bring home the paycheck, and you'll have a decent life, and you'll have this comfortable existence. And so there were many reasons that women decided to embrace this worldview, and not just for themselves, but work against the ERA, work against, feminist advances, because they earnestly believed that these were a threat. These were a threat to their way of life, to their very existence, and also because they believed that feminism went against God's will.
Yeah. I have this conversation fairly regularly with folks who are trying to navigate this whole space and say, well, look at the women who are perfectly happy in their housewife, the famous Clinton quote, home baking cookies, right?
Yeah.
So help me resolve all my issues. Help me resolve the debate, I suppose, because in many ways, just like the manufacturing of fear can be part of the process of this, there's also a manufacturing of well, what we're going to get to in some particular points of biblical manhood and womanhood and what a woman's place is in society, that then, of course, perpetuates itself in an acceptance of that. So is there any merit, I suppose, to appealing to the fact that there are someone who will, on their own accord, say, this is perfectly fine and this is what I want, and I'm very, very happy to that? Or should we be more diligent in analyzing, well, that may be, but it's because you've been taught a theology that may not actually be biblical? So.
I think there's space for both, really. I think we can ask the question. Yeah, I wouldn't want to tell anybody that you're only doing this because you've been taught a false, teaching of biblical womanhood. I think that, we're all wired different ways, and that we all have different gifts and we all have different interests, and then we find ourselves in different circumstances. And so I would like to allow for, for women to choose that, or at least to find, genuine fulfillment in that. Yeah. At the same time, I think it's very important to talk about history, to talk about how different women have been enculturated to desire certain things, to not pursue other things. I talk with a lot of women. My first book is a history of Christian feminism, and so I've done some different talks, and I've actually taught a course to retired women. And it was so fascinating to hear the stories of women in their 60s and 70s, Christian women who were very content with their lives. And they had, raised children, and they had all been either stay-at-home moms or secretaries or nurses or teachers, because those were the only options. And then when I brought them this long history of Christian feminism, and they started to think about their own lives. And nobody regretted the lives that they lived. Everybody was like, there was good there. But all of them were like, I wish I could have tried something else. I wish I could have, I've always kind of wanted to be a private investigator. That was just not an option, but I think I would have been a really good one. And there was this kind of longing, right? And so I think you can be content with the life that you had and still want to go back a little bit and think, what were the messages that I received? What are the messages that I am receiving? And maybe open that up a little bit.
Yeah. That's very diplomatic of you. I think it's the right answer too. I really appreciate that, and that's part of the problem, is that we make certain ideas absolute ideas. We make certain things the absolute, certain, clear teaching, which leads me to the next question. As if you were to leave no stone unturned, you run right into biblical inerrancy as well as a proxy fight over gender. So we were talking about John Wayne, we're talking about war, we're talking about feminism, and now we need to talk about biblical inerrancy as well. It's like this whole thing that's just a sweep right on through. So help us understand how biblical inerrancy became a proxy fight over gender.
Yeah, so if you go back into the history of the Southern Baptist Convention in particular, where these debates around biblical inerrancy really started to bubble up in the 1970s. Biblical inerrancy is something that theologians debated, and that it was important to certain leaders in the SBC, and it was something that conservatives were really trying to kind of buttress. But turns out, and here I'm drawing on the work of other historians, Seth Dowland and Betsy Flowers, both have written books on articles or books on this, and so I want to give them credit because it's really brilliant analysis. They demonstrate how the kind of theological debates about inerrancy didn't really trickle down all that much to the popular level, that it was hard to get people in the pews really incited about these theological conversations. Most weren't all that theologically astute. And what they discovered then, if they attached, and this is in the 1970s, if they attached gender issues, anti-feminism to these debates around inerrancy, that's when you can get people really riled up. And man.
That's
So what's really
amazing.
at the heart here? Is it biblical interpretation, kind of this pure theology, or is it just, culture wars, really? These social issues that are very much shaped by it's the historical moment. And that's really the conclusion that these historians draw.
So help me, I might have gotten a little confused. It wasn't the scholars debating inerrancy that was using gender, but it was the more lay people using gender to get to the inerrancy conversation. I'm so sorry if I missed.
No. So it was, the scholars were debating inerrancy among themselves, but realized that if they really wanted to, get support from, all the grassroots all the way down and to get, Southern Baptists, to have this kind of conservative resurgence, throughout the denomination, that it was a lot easier to get people on board if you're talking about gender roles. If you're talking about reinforcing conservative gender roles, and so then if you can link inerrancy to gender, then you can get people on board. If you're just having this theological conversation around inerrancy, it's not really going very far.
Oh, that's fascinating. You mentioned just now that the level of theological awareness or education down at the lay level wasn't necessarily, as robust. I mean, that makes sense, right? Lay people, they've got lives, they've got laundry, they have to do laundry. So, and I totally get that. But you also write, page 109, the issue of inerrancy did rally conservatives, but when it turned out that large numbers of Southern Baptist, even denominational officials, lacked any real theological prowess and were in fact functionally atheological, depending upon how you want to pronounce that, concerns over inerrancy gave way to a newly politicized commitment to female submission and to related culture war issues. So you don't hold anything back there. I mean, you're talking about even those who at the denominational official level who are having these discussions really aren't having a robust theological debate about inerrancy, but using that, well, as you mentioned, as a proxy fight essentially over gender.
Yeah, really. I mean, a theme of this book is kind of the reassessment of what is at the heart of evangelicalism. Evangelicals, evangelical leaders in particular, like to define themselves according to their theology, right? They'll have a theological rubric. We believe in the authority of the scriptures and the centrality of the cross and conversionism. And right, this is what it means to be an evangelical. As a cultural historian, I see that theology does not exist as an ideal, that theology is always kind of embedded in culture, and that people approach the scriptures and people produce their theologies very much shaped by their cultural moment. And so there are many examples in this book where theology is kind of set aside for cultural identity issues. I mean, one early example that's, I think, really helpful to kind of frame this a little bit is the Christian Booksellers Association and the role that it played in kind of creating an evangelical culture and how that differed from the way that books were written and sold before that time. So this comes about right in the 1950s. And before that, if you were writing religious books, one of the real problems was how do you distribute it? How do you get it into the hands of readers? And here, this is a brilliant work of another historian, Daniel Silliman, and he showed that you did it through denominations. So your denominational networks, which meant Lutherans were reading Lutheran books, like good Lutheran theology, but Presbyterians didn't want Lutheran books, right? So there, you through the Presbyterian churches, that's where you distribute the Presbyterian books. With the Christian Booksellers Association and the formation of the National Association of Evangelicals, they wanted to do the mass market. They wanted to reach evangelicals across the country. And so you don't do that through, and through Christian bookstores, but you don't do that through this distinctive theological literature because they don't want to read each other. Right? That's divisive. Instead, you go for Christian living literature, how to be a Christian wife, how to be a Christian man, how to raise your kids. And this is generic enough that you get the mass market, right? And so you can sell a lot of books. It's a great financial market, but it doesn't just, obviously, I think it ends up changing the content of the books, and it changes the content of the faith in many ways, that these issues of Christian living, of gender, of social issues really move to the fore, and traditional doctrinal issues really get set aside over time. And I think we see that in evangelicalism today when even recent surveys demonstrate that, yes, there are high levels of theological illiteracy among white evangelicals, alarmingly so, which raises the question, what is the essence of evangelicalism? Is it ultimately theology, or is it something else?
Yeah, it's another example of how the market dumbs things down a little bit, right?
It is.
And I don't mean that so pejoratively, but just to simply say that if you want to go wide, you can't go as deep, right? And that's part of the issue.
Absolutely.
That makes so much sense why there has been kind of a decrying of a lack of biblical understanding or a lack of biblical education amongst the general populace of the church. And this is really, really helpful to understand that, if you're trying to make money as a publisher, there's only certain avenues by which you can do that. Yeah. And so you got to look to them. I mean, all of that just makes amazing sense. So that's really, really helpful. Hey, friends, for those of you who are watching, I'm going to head right to the Slido after one more question. So if you haven't had a chance to ask a question or upvote, there's a whole bunch of them that have come in. So I'm super excited to get to the questions that have come in through Slido, but we're running close to our time, and I want to make sure that I honor the questions that you submit. So submit your questions at the Slido. The event number is right below me and to upload to that. Okay. We're actually talking about kind of the overall theme that I think helps many of us who are wrestling with what the heck is evangelicalism, and especially in our sociopolitical context. Am I one? Do I even want to be associated with one? Is that the same thing as Christianity? So I want to kind of land there, and then I'll have a final quote based upon the Gaither Vocal Band song that I love that you cited in your book. But anyway, before we get there, you write on page 297, 298. Despite evangelicals' frequent claim that the Bible is this is what we were just talking about, that the Bible is the source of their social and political commitments, evangelicalism must be seen as a cultural and political movement rather than as a community defined chiefly by its theology. Evangelical views on any given issue are facets of this larger cultural identity, and no number of Bible verses will dislodge the greater truths at the heart of this. So, in light of that, what would you say to our audience about how to think about evangelicalism? Is it worth saving? Do we need to redefine it? You just simply say, well, it's a cultural political movement. Do we jettison the name? Help us navigate. Do you identify? I'm sorry, I shouldn't ask you too many personal questions, but what do we do with that term? And then I think, for me, it's a broader question too, because what do you do with even the term Christianity? Because American Christianity is so tied to evangelicalism in that term as well. So after all of your research, how would you navigate that minefield right there?
Oh yeah, there's a lot there. I'm not one to tell other people what they should be doing here. I would support people who still strongly identify as evangelicals and are working within evangelicalism to bring reform. I also support people who say, I cannot do this anymore. I'm not an evangelical, and are walking away. I don't identify as an evangelical. It gets really tricky because it depends on, what your definition is. I actually belong to a denomination that technically is a member of the National Association of Evangelicals. Mm-hmm. So I could identify as one if I went with denominational definitions. As a cultural historian, I'm actually working against those. Right. And so it's because I have, really don't identify with this culture that I describe, even though I was influenced in certain ways growing up. But I also grew up in an ethnic subculture. I'm Dutch Reformed, small town. My mom immigrated from the Netherlands. So I always kind of was on the margins, if at all. I actually grew up identifying against evangelicalism culturally more than identifying with it. So I don't personally identify as an evangelical, but I think evangelical adjacent is a proper term. So very close for me, but not quite in. But I think for evangelicals wondering what next, I think that for those who stay within and want to, and I talk with many, many evangelicals who say, again, this is the story of my life, but I am not okay with this. From leaders, prominent leaders down to just ordinary folks. And the advice that I've kind of started giving, I guess, with the caveat that I'm a historian, so I don't know what I'm talking about as soon as I'm not talking about the past. But the advice that I give anyway is to remember that Christianity is not contained within white evangelicalism. And
do we have to say that out loud?
It needs to be said
Yeah.
because I think white evangelicals, right, have again, the faithful remnant. Christianity depends on us. The American nation depends on us. And that's a huge burden to bear. And one of my favorite quotes in the book is actually a quote from Rachel Den Hollander, that God does not need your protection. God only asks for your obedience. And what that looks like is doing justice. And that's like a liberating quote, right? Instead of trying to, like, it is all on us. We need to protect. We need to defend, our faith, our family, our nation. That's not the message of the scriptures, right? It's on God. It's okay. Just your obedience, doing justice. So to remember that the fate of Christianity does not rest on the fate of evangelicalism is important. To remember that Christianity has always thrived outside of white evangelical spaces. And in fact, it is thriving there right now. And so if you are very distressed about the state of American evangelicalism, of white evangelicalism today, maybe the first thing you shouldn't do is try to fix it, especially if you're a leader who kind of brought us to where we are. Maybe the first thing you need to do is go listen to others, go learn from others that maybe you've excluded from your communities, from your churches, maybe just didn't actively exclude, but never even thought to include. And here we're talking about racial difference, political difference, social issues, to spend some time and listen and learn from other people of faith. And before, quick trying to just build it from the ground up once again. And then maybe you'll find that Christianity is flourishing elsewhere and you can just stay there. Or maybe you can learn some things and eventually come back. But I think that the urge that many evangelicals and particularly leaders feel to fix it right now is maybe something that needs to be considered or considered carefully. Yeah. But I think everybody is kind of situated differently, and there's a different calling that different people are going to feel, and I'm all for supporting people in whatever they feel called to do in this moment.
Yeah, I love your answer, and I also feel like that's for some can be a tall order, because evangelicalism is not just an identity, but you've been told that those other expressions, certain strains of evangelicalism, those other expressions are actually false gospels, or they're outside of the truth, right? So it's a tall order. It's a heavy lift for some, but I appreciate that. Okay, friends, we're going to do our best to try to get through these Slido questions. And if we don't get to them all, maybe I will ask if Kristin will stick around for just a few moments to answer them within our time frame here. Number one upvoted question: after all the research you've done, where do you find hope now in the evangelical community or for yourself? Which we kind of touched on, but maybe you want to expand a little bit.
Oh, more. I have more to say on that.
Oh, good, good.
So when I finished this manuscript a year and a half ago, my editor read it. We had tweaked it. It was almost ready to go into production. And then my editor wrote to me and said, Kristin, this is a really depressing book. So he's like, can you give us something to work with in the conclusion? Give us some hope. Like, your readers are going to need it. And so I really thought carefully, and I looked over the whole book, and I thought, I can't. This is where I'm at, right? It's not looking good. And so I wrote him and said, I really can't come up with something authentically. And he's like, okay, I respect that. And then about 2 days later, he writes back again. He's like, Kristin, just give us something, anything. And so I gave him the last sentence of the book, which is, what was once done might also be undone. And honestly, at the time, I felt so sheepish. I'm like, this is so weak. But I really do believe that, right? Mm-hmm. Like I was saying before, that if you show how things came to be, you're freed up to ask, is this where we want to be? And you're freed up to realize we don't have to make the same choices again. But the real hope came not with that one little sentence, honestly. It's with the reception of this book, that this book has been enormously popular within white evangelical spaces. And that is something that I still find overwhelming. I've received so many hundreds of letters from evangelicals saying thank you. I receive several a day. I think I got 5 today. Gorgeous, gorgeous letters from people deep inside evangelicalism. And that honestly has given me a lot of hope. There's a lot of goodness.
This is totally a side note. Your story with your editor sounds like the book of Ecclesiastes to me, because there's this textual discussion about the end, and it ends, according to some scholars, right at the most depressing point. And then there's this addendum that says, well, in the end, love God and obey his commandments. And so it sounds exactly like your story. It's like God coming to the author of, can you just give me a little something at the end here?
And an editor does feel like God in the moment. So yes. It works.
That's awesome. Can you speak to the connection between abolition of slavery and the suffrage movement? Did Southerners react to abolition by doubling down on control of women? Okay, so we're going to be here for the next 3 hours.
Like, oh, okay. You can definitely see that. In the book, I just have a very, very short glimpse back to the 19th century and to Southern ideals of masculinity in particular. And there, too, we can see that race and gender are very tightly intertwined, that a man's authority over his wife and children is linked to his authority over enslaved people. And that is... there's this wonderful book that I read in graduate school that really influenced me. It's called Masters of Small Worlds. And it shows how even very poor white men understood that they had a stake in white patriarchy, because they could be the masters of their tiny little kingdoms, their home. And then the masters of the huge plantations had so much more to gain. But that's we can see that race trumps class in that case. And gender as well.
We touched on this briefly. One part of this next question: How has the white evangelical treatment of masculinity informed transphobia and/or racism? So we talked a little bit about racism, but we didn't necessarily touch on transphobia.
Yeah, transphobia, LGBTQ issues, right? These really strike at the heart of a worldview that is founded on the essential significance of gender difference. Right? When I was reading this literature, just gender difference was so important to people like James Dobson and everybody who came after him. James Dobson wrote that men and women are different in every cell of their bodies. I'm like, okay, technically you got a point, but right, if you look at the scriptures, the vast majority of verses in the scriptures are written to people regardless of sex or gender, right? That this is, in evangelicals, rather than just thinking about what does it mean to follow Christ, have this very strong tendency to always for men or for women, and not only just distinctive but opposite. Right. So you are this, which means you are not this. So what happens then is like things like, the fruit of the spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. These things get coded as feminine, and therefore men don't need to be exhibiting these traits, and that then they get the aggression and they get the courage and the strength and the militancy, and you can see how we get to where we are today. So you take something like same-sex attraction, or certainly transgender, even more so, is going to destabilize the stark gender difference, which is really kind of foundational for their entire worldview. So that's something where I think that rather than just seeing, Christian opposition to, in their words, homosexuality as this, forever and ever, amen kind of thing, we have to see why in this historical moment it became such a polarizing issue. And we can ask the same thing about the issue of abortion too. So how does it make sense in terms of these larger cultural issues that we've already identified?
Yeah, I've always felt that some people have misunderstood the retort that many conservatives have, and I apologize for the using the label there, but for lack of better terminology, many people have regarding, well, gay marriage is an assault on my marriage. And people will usually say, what are you talking about? You're fine. And what you just said is really the issue at hand. It's an assault on the worldview that is held, that supports the world, the way in which the genders are supposed to be ordered. And so I think that often gets missed in the mix of the conversation, that that's what they mean when they say that gay marriage or homosexuality is an assault on my marriage. It goes to exactly what you're talking about there. Okay, maybe just a couple more, because I want to be respectful of your time. It's super late where you are. So what is your response to women who continue promoting gender roles / anti-feminist ideals on YouTube and everything else today? So let's talk about YouTube.
Oh, absolutely. No, so this is actually my next book.
Oh, very nice.
Yeah. I'll put a little plug, even though it's not actually written very much yet, but it needs to be before too long. So my next book is Live, Laugh, Love, and it is a cultural history of white Christian womanhood, and it examines this culture of looking at inspirational fiction and direct sales marketing and HGTV and mommy blogs and all this stuff. And yes, YouTube and Instagram, and looking at how it supports conservative political ideologies, neoliberalism, and white supremacy.
Wow.
So it's all there. And what would I say to them? I'll have a lot more to say in about 2 years.
I was going to say you'll have about 75,000 words worth of response to all of that.
Yeah, probably closer to 100,000. I tend to be long-winded. Yeah.
Okay. Well, tack on that extra 25,000. That's fantastic. Right. We'll very much look forward to that coming out. This is one that hits very close to home to a lot of families. For those of us raising kids, what are some protective factors, values we can help foster in their spiritual growth that isn't toxic evangelical masculinity?
I have 3 kids, so I should have a better answer to this. Yeah, and I actually really need to gather a list of resources, because there are good resources out there. They're harder to come by, right? It's hard to kind of sift through, because raising kids is not easy, and each kid is different. And oh my goodness, so it's a lot. I don't have any sparklingly clear advice. I think just to not feel that you have to reinforce gender for the sake of reinforcing gender roles, norms, ideals. To think in terms of, God made each person, each child unique. And we talk about that in some respects, but then when it comes to gender, all of a sudden it's this binary, and we try to fit people into these very clear boxes that actually very few people fit neatly into. And so just to think of the giftedness of each child that we're given, and to help that child discover, who they are and who they are in Christ. And in some ways it's less scary, to try to, you don't have to get things right in the same way. It's more about, orienting towards love, towards mercy, to just really think about what do you want to disciple your children into. And the scriptures provide, just, I think, a wonderful model there. Hard to follow, but, inspirational. And rather than trying to enforce, these categories or these boundaries, I would also say, the question of power is really important. Just generally, when we think about our faith, when we think about what it is to be a faithful Christian, what is the essence of Christianity, and how is it connected to power? And is it that Christians need to be grasping power to use coercive force to bring righteousness or achieve good? Or is the essence of Christianity turning that on its head, looking at Jesus and looking at who people thought he ought to be, this Messiah, and who he was not. He was not the worldly leader, and he divested himself of power. And that is the radical nature of the Christian faith. That's the faith that I'm drawn to. And if we just understand, and get that understanding of power right, and then that's the life that we aspire to, which again is hard, and hold that out for our children. I think that's that's a good way forward.
That's absolutely beautiful. If I may, I'll add one additional piece, which is to find a community that embraces all of that. And I'm so sorry I'm going to do this, but I want to shout out to my Spark community, my church. They've created a beautiful community in which, we're hosting conversations like this to ensure that we don't, perpetuate the sins of the fathers and the mothers, I suppose, in that particular sense. So thank you to all you Sparkers. And I know there's some people who are watching that are not a part of our community, but I'm just so grateful for our community that does that. Okay, last question from Slido, and then we'll do a closer. Rich asked this really intriguing question. How could Christianity not be patriarchal given its authorship? So I don't know exactly what he means by that, like whether that's biblical authorship or the idea that there's a lot of patriarchs in Christian history, but I'm kind of curious how you would respond to that.
Yeah, I think that there certainly is a history of Christian patriarchy, which is a different question of whether Christianity is in its essence patriarchal. And so one more plug for another book that's actually coming out in 6 weeks. So it's this new book, and I think you're going to be having the author Beth Barr in April, I think. She is going to give the most brilliant answer to that question and to demonstrate how what we think about Christianity being essentially patriarchal may not in fact be true. And she's a medieval historian, so she covers this huge swath of Christian history to show how these patriarchal distortions have come into the scriptures and come into Christian practice. And so I'll pass the baton to Beth Barr on that one because it's such an important book. Yep. The book is Making Biblical Womanhood, and it's out in April. How
the subjugation of women became gospel truth. Yes, thank you for putting a plug. April 26th, Beth Allison Barr, Dr. Barr, will be with us for this exact same format and conversation when her book comes out. So I'm super excited about that. Dr. Du Mez, Kristin, if I may, you have been so kind and generous with your time. Thank you so much. So appreciate it. This was really incredible. Patriarchy, war and militarism, feminism, we didn't even get to family values and James Dobson, but racism tied with masculinity, the idea of biblical inerrancy as a proxy war for gender. I mean, there's just so much richness here. It's so brilliant and so wonderful. This has been a great conversation. So thankful to you. I would like to close on this question. I've listened to the Gaither Vocal Band song, Jesus and John Wayne, probably about 30 times since I read it in your book. I didn't know about the song prior to. And the chorus goes something like this. Not something like this. It goes like this. Somewhere between Jesus and John Wayne, a cowboy and a saint, crossing the open range, the cross and the open range. I try to be more like you, Lord, but most days I know I ain't. I'm somewhere between Jesus and John Wayne. And man, in listening to this song over and over again, I feel as if that we are still wrestling. Now, I'm so happy to hear the response that you're getting from a lot of white evangelicals, et cetera. But I still feel like that song, I think, speaks to still the thing. Like, as much as I am so glad I get to do conversations and read books like this, it's still in me, right? I mean, it still informs, it's almost an impulse. And so I still feel like I'm in the middle. I didn't even get to the quote where Jesus will save your soul, but John Wayne will save your ass. We didn't even get to that quote. And I still feel like there's this tension. And I'm kind of curious if you would just close us by answering the question, so where should we be between Jesus and John Wayne? That might be a loaded question, but you cited it in your book, and I love the song, and I think it speaks to the tension. Where would you guide us, lead us as a closing remark to all of our wonderful people that are watching right now?
I'd say just drop John Wayne. Forget John Wayne, right?
It's that simple.
Following Christ, right? To follow Christ. So we're not between Jesus and John Wayne. We're between, where we individually are and where we need to be in terms of following Christ. And for each of us, that looks different. And to stress that that does not mean that there's no place for courage, that there is no place for resilience, that there's no place for bravery, and all of these things. I think many of the values that people think, oh, but those are good things and those are inspiring, and there is a place for those in what it means to follow Christ. And it does not look like John Wayne Christianity. It does not. So I do think we have to set the John Wayne aside in this equation and really keep focused on Christ, really focused on Christ, and then seeing what that looks like to follow Christ.
I've had some of these conversations recently, and people say, well, what do I do with this? What do I do with that? And I have found myself frequently saying, just follow Jesus. It's kind of that simple. Like if you're wrestling with a cultural, just follow Jesus, And I think I really appreciate that answer. Just drop John Wayne. It should be that simple. Drop your nets and follow me, as Jesus said. So we will leave it there. Thank you again, Kristin, so much for your time. This was incredible and amazing, so enlightening and inspiring and hopeful. Yes, it was even hopeful. That last tag, what was made could also be unmade. And so I want to thank all of you who are watching live right now. Thank you so much for tuning in. You are a part of the different kind of remnant who is working to unmake that which was made regarding this Christian patriarchy. Thank you, Kristin, so much. Everybody, have a wonderful night. And I'm going to leave you with the Gaither Vocal Band and this song that I've been listening to. Have a wonderful night, everybody. And if you have any questions, of course, reach out to us, and we'd love to chat with you. Thanks again for coming. Here's the Gaither Vocal Band.